welcome to the Daniels faculty. My name is Jewel Amoa, and I'm the Assistant Dean for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion here at Daniels. I want to thank all of you for attending this evening's event, a presentation by the faculty's Lukas Pauer. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. This land is also home to many of us who have come here voluntarily and involuntarily. As we acknowledge the original stewards of this land, this evening's lecture is also an opportunity to reflect on the relationship that each of us has with this land, our ongoing systems of colonization, and with one another. As many of you may know, the name of the avenue on which our faculty sits, Spadina, comes from the Anishinaabe word Ishpadina and means a place on a hill. This site was also part of an important trail for several First Nations. As an institution committed to promoting truth and reconciliation, we note this history and we wish to honor these connections as we move forward collectively. This evening's lecture, titled Recognizing Facts on the Ground, Deconstructing Power in the Built Environment, offers an overview of Lukas Pauer's multidimensional, very timely work. Lukas is a licensed architect, urbanist, historian, and educator. In 2022, he joined the faculty as one of its inaugural Emerging Architect Fellows and as an assistant professor of architecture. His contribution to disciplinary intersections is reflected in his simultaneous engagements as a faculty affiliate in urban studies, at the School of Cities, and as a faculty affiliate in global affairs and public policy at the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies in the Munk School. Just this winter, Lukas was awarded the new Faculty Teaching Award from the Association of Collegiate Schools of Architecture. This award recognizes instructional excellence and innovation during the formative years of an architectural teaching career. And I believe that, in fact, Lukas will be collecting this award tomorrow. Congratulations, Lukas. He has also curated the exhibition How to Steal a Country, which is on display just behind us here in the Larry Wayne Richards Gallery, and it will be on view until May 14th. If all of this wasn't enough, Lukas is also the founding director of the Vertical Geopolitics Lab, an investigative practice think tank at the intersections of architecture, geography, politology, and media, dedicated to exposing intangible systems and hidden agendas within the built environment. These subjects have direct bearing on the exhibition and on the lecture this evening. In recent years, Lukas has worked on a series of projects aimed at decoding and deconstructing built objects that political actors around the world have used to project power. In so doing, his academic practice has sought to empower underrepresented and vulnerable individuals and communities. Tonight, Lukas will expound further on how this integrated practice, research, and teaching is an effort to recenter the study of how sovereignty is acquired and disputed as a practice-based matter of space and of power. After his presentation, Lukas will engage in a Q&A session with architecture student Emma Wang and Lily Parker, a student of politology. And we'll also take some questions from the audience. Now, please help me in welcoming Lukas Pauer.
Thank you, Jewel. Thanks very much, Jewel. These words mean a lot to me, and also thank you for the acknowledgement of land, which is something that is very crucial, very key to the kind of work that the lab has been doing over the years, and in fact the work that I'm going to talk specifically about tonight, which relates to a dedication I'd like to introduce with and lead for this evening, which is a dedication not just for an individual, it's a dedication for a community of people, for communities of people, in fact nations around the world, victims of imperial colonial violence throughout history, not only the past, but also ongoing today. In fact, colonialism is not an event of the past, but colonialism is in fact an ongoing process. My hope is for this work to not just help develop an understanding of how built objects, architecture, infrastructure have been instrumentalized in the perpetuation of power disparities, hierarchies, and biases. More so, I hope to empower future generations in their efforts to expose, challenge, and reconstitute the pervasive and ongoing reality of imperial colonial violence. Have you ever been lied to? That is a question that is very important to ask ourselves, because I am sure that you have been lied to without perhaps not even, in fact, actually being lied to. Because there's a term for being lied to without actually being lied to, and it's called doublespeak. Doublespeak is a term, it's also a scholarly field, becoming a scholarly field, which essentially refers to the use of language, ambiguous language, to get a kind of meaning across, a meaning that is not necessarily initially what it seems. An example of doublespeak might be that a government or a press release might not say that they're bombing a place, but in fact they're quote-unquote servicing a target. Some of you might have at some point in your career been fired by a company, and the company would have not presented this to you as being fired, but you were laid off. Downsizing, in fact, is the kind of media speak that is being used. So you have scholars like George Orwell, Politics in the English Language, Doublespeak by William Lutz, and this is something that is known in kind of written and visual studies. But at the same time, what's crucial in the work of the lab, of the Vertical Geopolitics Lab, which is a lab that I'm the founding director of, is to kind of expand this discourse that is often limited to kind of textual and visual studies to also the built environment, material and spatial dimensions. So you have works such as How to Lie with Statistics or How to Lie with Maps, and the very exhibition that some of you have already perhaps seen just in the back of us, How to Steal a Country, is within this kind of context of, in fact, looking at how built objects, which is buildings, infrastructure, perhaps have been used to instrumentalized to get a different kind of meaning across than originally may seem the case. This is the context of the exhibition How to Steal a Country, which is really situated in this context of architecture as an instrument of power projection. This is the research-based debut exhibition of the lab, and really details how Russia has instrumentalized architecture to undermine Ukrainian sovereignty from 2014 to its ongoing full-scale invasion since 2022. And I'm sure that many of you may be familiar with this kind of situation. In fact, I have seen some of you kind of put down a jacket or a scarf to kind of reserve the seats in this very lecture hall to essentially kind of stake a claim to reserve your chair, to demarcate your authority over the chair that you'd like to sit on. And this might happen in libraries, this might happen for a seat on your bus, a space you'd like to reserve in your library. And this kind of behavior is the kind of behavior that we're looking at in the lab at a larger scale, at the scale of buildings, of architecture, infrastructure that is instrumentalized in the context of international relations. In the domain of international relations, where power projection is facilitated, instrumentalized, is legitimized through the use of buildings. So this may be telecommunications infrastructure, such as a lighthouse, a radar station. In this case, perhaps with the supposed argument that it's about facilitating the safety of navigation, whilst it might be an object that is being used to, in fact, facilitate a claim over territory, over land, to fulfill certain legal requirements that allow a country to stake a claim. Why is this important? Why do we care? Why should we look at this in the context of the built environment and international relations? There's a lack of general understanding of imperial colonial violence as a pervasive and ongoing reality around the world. To not recognize the workings of this violence around us is a risk. Although recent scholarship kind of alludes that there is a relationship between space and power, as well as the kind of various ways in which power has configured space, many people seeking to participate in the political life of their community still lack the vocabulary to describe how authority over people and land is manifested through seemingly minor or banal practices of the everyday. And it's really the kind of keyword of vocabulary here that, that we're going to discuss quite a fair bit tonight, which is the idea of literacy, of reading and writing. How can we read, how can we develop a kind of vocabulary to see built objects being being instrumentalized in the built environment to stake a claim in the domain of international relations, but not excluding this conversation, not only limited to international relations, but really to kind of bridge across through everyday language so that everyone can actually understand what's going on. Our verbal and visual vocabulary of the world around us has a large impact on what we are able to perceive and understand. So this relates to this project of literacy, of being able to decode, to read power in the built environment. It's difficult to recognize what we cannot name. Often, the language we use to describe how power has been written into the built environment around us is limited. For example, at times capitalizing on their ambiguity, built objects, so architecture, buildings, infrastructure, seem to be neither diplomatic nor military in function, which renders their political instrumentalization plausible, deniable. This is really the work of the lab over several years. We have studied kind of the notion of power projection and how it relates to the built environment, looking at the kind of longue durée of imperial colonial expansion and the various kind of techniques that have been instrumentalized by powers throughout history and ongoing today. So the ancient, medieval, modern, and really recent context of power projection throughout history in order to kind of expose and look at techniques that have been applied by powers such as many Euro-Western powers throughout Euro-Western imperial colonial expansionist history up until today. And essentially, this evening will be a glimpse of this long-term project that the lab has been undertaking, in which we have applied this sort of long-term framework into the context of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So the exhibition that has opened right behind me is taking place in the Richards Gallery, the title being How to Steal a Country, which really refers to this kind of framework that I introduced earlier today. And one of the first things that you may see when you enter the gallery is that you are being directed at a series of niches. We have referred to them in the project as immersive niches, related to the idea of immersing our audience in a perception of spaces that seem mundane, that seem banal, that seem everyday, but in fact are key moments, key scenes from the Russian invasion that essentially display architectural situations, scenes in which these kinds of objects, in which built objects have been instrumentalized for power projection. So you can see on the far left side a niche that we'll talk about later, which will depict bank branches. The one next to it depicts humanitarian aid operations. The one next to it on the right will depict child boarding and care facilities. And we're going to end up also talking about telecommunications infrastructure in the context of internet and telephone facilities. Not by chance, directly opposite of these immersive niches, in fact, is what we have referred to as the synoptic wall. A wall on which we've kind of attached a series of texts that are essentially synopsis of the four main niches that are displayed in the gallery. And these four niches each refer, as I mentioned earlier, to a kind of specific case type, a case type of a particular building, such as a bank branch. And directly opposite of each niche, you would have a synoptic text that kind of introduces, in a way, talking about the relevance of each of these different case types. And you will notice that there's quite sparse use of cartographic drawings in the exhibition. In fact, we are reducing the exhibition to 4 key cartographic drawings, 4 maps, a map for each section. And there's a conceptual reason why we've limited the use of maps in the gallery. The reason being that maps are often, we think, overused in the context of talking about international relations and the kind of the use of buildings to project power. Maps refer to a kind of legal fiction. Just as much as legal text and cartographic drawings, they are different from the kind of facts that we talk about on the ground, which are these kinds of buildings, these markers that are in fact instrumentalized in the context of power projection. What I mean by legal fiction is a situation like this on the ground. This, in fact, if we would look at a map, if we would look at the globe of the Earth and we see borders, boundary lines that are being projected evenly around the Earth, it might seem that the Earth is kind of evenly carved up in these boundary lines that all seem impermeable, that seem very fixed, rigid. But in fact, these impermeable conditions are conditions that are a lot more fluid and more porous and less fixed than they actually appear. More often than not, you have these punctual moments, these scenes, these architectural objects that represent these boundaries as markers, as facts on the ground. The moment we saw earlier, the photo, is a very exceptional condition in which a kind of boundary line is being demarcated as a line, is being extruded to a fence, but the idea of fences and walls are really an exception. So the work of the lab has really focused on something that the visitor of the gallery here is particularly looking at, which are the massing models that we attached right next to the text, right next to the cartographic drawings, which are the very moments we refer to as the facts on the ground in the exhibition. These are the key objects, the architecture, the infrastructure that is being used to legitimize sovereignty. In other words, of central importance to this work, and in particular to this exhibition, a study of how imperial colonial expansion has been performed architecturally, both throughout history, but also ongoing, is the phrase facts on the ground. It describes a circumstance in which practical actual claims to sovereignty differ from and have superseded legal formal claims to sovereignty. What we mean by legal formal claims is this kind of legal fiction of maps, of legal documents that I talked about earlier, and what we mean by practical actual claims, practical actual moments are these buildings, these markers, these facts on the ground that we refer to. So sovereignty is a key term to the work of the lab and to this exhibition in particular. And if we untangle the very definition of sovereignty, it actually refers to authority over people and land. Authority over people of land and land, and if we untangle authority in itself, if we go a level further, authority by definition is recognized power, a power that is being seen, a power that is being recognized by another, either individual or community. And if it is in fact being recognized, or if it depends on that recognition in order to be legit, in order to become an authority, it by definition actually means that sovereignty or authority depends on an audience. As such, the very definition of sovereignty is a theatrical concept. It depends on being seen. And really the hinge kind of between authority and on the ground is the marker, is the fact, are the kind of the buildings that we've studied in the context of this exhibition. So what I'm going to do is I'll run you through glimpses of the exhibition, or what we would have referred to in the project as essentially scenes on the ground. Whereas the first niche that I'm going to discuss is essentially in the context of humanitarian aid operations. An enclosed space emulates the interior of the back of a humanitarian aid truck. A small collection of aid supplies in boxes and bags are pushed to the back. A rigid framework of wood and steel belies the truck's soft, unassuming white tarp exterior. Over the aid boxes drapes a flag reminiscent of the Red Cross. It could almost be mistaken for the real thing. So Russia has established its presence in Ukraine under the guise of humanitarian aid operations. It's essentially responded to a crisis that the Russian government itself has manufactured. And it's interesting here that one of the key arguments that we're making in this very niche is actually that humanitarian aid is commonly understood as a kind of benevolent act. One may think that it doesn't come with strings attached, but it often very much so does come with strings attached, even though it has that sort of reputation of an apolitical act. So really, in this case, Russia has attempted to garner positive public perception of its intentions by promoting itself as a benevolent actor, providing aid to a crisis-stricken Ukraine. So what I'm going to do is I'll run you through this very niche by going through 4 sequential scenes. We've referred to them as scenes, depicted in various different media and different formats that we in the exhibition have categorized in 3 different types, and I'll mention those recurrently. The first type being scene drawings. You'll see 2 of those here in the niche in squares, and the other one being 2 scene models, which are essentially enclosed dioramas. So referring back to the notion of sovereignty being a kind of theatrical concept, depending on audience, we really have kind of untangled the idea of how the Russian government has legitimized facts on the ground by showing how it has depicted it in various types of scenes, depending on audience. So you will see each time we're going to discuss a scene that they'll essentially be kind of decoded and untangled in terms of how meaning is being made and what the Russian governments kind of want to see in order to supposedly legitimize the invasion of Ukraine. So what you can see here in the scene 1, separatist checkpoint sign conversion scene, is how Russian-backed separatists kind of shelled and seized a border checkpoint in eastern Ukraine. This is a border checkpoint through which eventually humanitarian aid would enter into Ukraine. This scene model or enclosed diorama depicts a scene from humanitarian aid essentially being screened by journalists. And this is an important fact to mention because part of the technique, part of the strategy of the Russian government has essentially been to invite journalists as opposed to Ukrainian government officials to inspect humanitarian aid. As such, it is kind of, it has bypassed, it has circumvented the invitation of Ukrainian officials, which it had invited, but it had kind of made it difficult for actual Ukrainian border patrol officers to inspect the aid cargo. So it's invited journalists of various media outlets to quote-unquote inspect the trucks. Also bypassing a kind of previously agreed upon border checkpoint. Closer to the actual border checkpoint that was steered towards by the Russian government's kind of humanitarian aid cargo is really here, and it's important to mention that in the context of the kind of scene that was depicted earlier, where a checkpoint had been shelled, it was essentially a checkpoint that was occupied by Russian-backed separatist forces. It was not, in fact, a Ukrainian government checkpoint that was staffed by Ukrainian officers at the time, but it had already been taken over by Russian-backed separatist forces. The moment just before the convoy would kind of enter Russian separatist forces-held territory, the checkpoint is, in fact, actually close to a Russian Orthodox priest who is being stationed there strategically, kind of blessing the convoy as it passes close to and into Ukraine. It is very common for Russian Orthodox priests to bless objects or actions, but you can see here really kind of a priest in cassock and vestments blesses a truck with holy water, a protective image inspired by the famous Russian painter Rublev. The icon Holy Trinity rests upon the truck's dashboard that you can see on the top left. And I'll read in this context an immersive text, a type of text that we have in the exhibition referred to as immersive texts. We've written these kind of on labels that you can see if you visit the exhibition. Each of the kind of factual descriptions are accompanied with immersive texts that are equally based in open source intelligence as the descriptions decoding what you can see in the image, but the immersive texts are sort of painting a scene by describing in evocative language how it would feel to be in the moment, to see what is happening. So I'll read this immersive text in this case. Every single truck is white. They drive to the gate in single file, maintaining the same speed, braking and accelerating in turn as they crawl toward Ukraine's eastern border. They drive up to a gate, greeted by an Orthodox priest in cassock and vestments. He claims a barrier gate as a makeshift table. There's water in a plastic bottle that he pours into a chalice and blesses it into holy water before dispersing it in sprinkling showers on the nearest truck. Once blessed, a truck drives off, and in the rear view mirror, the driver sees that the priest is still there, his arm flicking the holy water like a beckoning cat. The trucks cross the border, blessed by the priest. The next scene that you can see, a separatist checkpoint crossing scene, is essentially depicting a moment in which it becomes clear that the very checkpoint that we saw earlier, which was planned to be crossed by the Russian government, has in fact already been shelled. It is not in fact a supposed Ukrainian checkpoint, but it's already a Russian-backed separatist-held checkpoint. You can see even the kind of flags that ornament the trucks are flags that give the appearance of multilateral action. They are flags of the Red Cross. They are not Russian humanitarian aid flags. They are flags that make the humanitarian aid appear as a kind of multilateral international effort blessed by the Red Cross. It would become later known that in fact this was not in fact blessed as such by the International Red Cross based in Geneva, but in fact collaborated with by the Russian Moscow-based Red Cross. So the convoy instead entered Ukraine without its permission, passing windows previously shattered by paramilitary forces. Talking about further scenes, we're heading into a section of the exhibition that will depict bank branches. The angles of the stark white niche funnels people toward a bank teller station. The notice posted on the station's plexiglass shield barrier instructs clients about the new identification documents they will need to acquire and present in order to access basic banking services. A new Russian passport, along with Russian rubles, can be seen by the bank teller station. So you can see here the kind of use of life-size replicas that we've carefully reconstructed from very specific moments in the context of the scenes depicted. In fact, all of the scenes depicted in the whole exhibition are reconstructed based on open source intelligence. None of the depictions that you see, none of the illustrations are illustrations that are not based on open source intelligence. So in this case, the Russian government and Russian-backed separatists have established their own bank branches across occupied Ukrainian territory. And it's really to kind of institute Russian commercial bank privileges and undermine Ukrainian authority. These banks have effectively leveraged local residents' need to withdraw money, access salaries, and receive pensions. These three kind of actions that you would commonly go to a bank for is one that one immediately kind of thinks of when it comes to banks. But in fact, why this was done in this particular case is to kind of really leverage a situation of desperation in the context of the separatist movement in eastern Ukraine, where in fact what happened at the time is that after, and this is what you can see here in kind of this first scene depicted, is that after a long wait, crowds of elderly people in this case lined up in various kind of local banks in an effort to access their pensions. Because what happened actually in the kind of turmoil of the separatist movement waging in eastern Ukraine, which eventually became known was in fact Russian-backed, is that most local Ukrainian banks in fact withdrew. So what happened is that many local elderly people could not suddenly access their pensions anymore, which is when these kind of Russian banks came in, and in this case you have a kind of pension fund that is being established in order to pay Ukrainian people's pensions. The next scene kind of depicts an opening of a bank account in what is really a kind of makeshift bank branch that was being established on the ground, in this case in the context of Mariupol. You can see on the right-hand side in these original photographic sources that the scene is based on and has been carefully reconstructed. You can see that actually what's also being decoded in this diorama is the kind of documents that are needed to force really local people to sign up suddenly with Russian documentation. You cannot open a bank account, as many of you know, without documents that are recognized by a bank office. And in this case, it's documents that were specifically asked for as being Russian documents. So as one can imagine, a lot of people did not have Russian passports and were essentially forced to naturalize, to acquire Russian citizenship, which was really the kind of one of the intended aims of the Russian government. You can see here the kind of conversion scene of a former Ukrainian bank branch that's being turned into a Russian bank branch. And here what you can see is kind of another scene in which you see basically the conversion of price tags from Ukrainian currency to Russian currency, the ruble. Eventually, what would happen is that you had a mandate of the ruble being the only accepted currency. Discussing the kind of next section of the exhibition, we need to talk about telecommunications infrastructure. So what you can see here kind of in the immersive niche is essentially internet and telephone telecommunications facilities. So once you are in this kind of environment, which mimics really one such ICT facilities, is essentially a feeling of being immersed in ICT infrastructure, being information and communications technology equipment. This equipment sits at the back of the niche. The audiovisual display is always on. Russian telecommunications interception software is always scanning. The walls are out of cold concrete, impersonal, inhuman, and strictly functional. A network of steel pipes overhead hints at connecting an internal function to an external, far away, and unseen. Telecommunications infrastructure has been crucial to the Russian government's efforts to strengthen its hold over occupied Ukrainian territory. The Russian government has marshaled a wide range of network infrastructure to block and limit access to sensitive websites, monitor users' phones and internet access, and build detailed profiles of targeted dissidents and anti-war activists across occupied Ukraine and Russia. So again, what you have here is these kind of 4 sequential scenes. Going through these 4 sequential scenes, I'd like to begin with one that in fact depicts a kind of scene which is very traditional, let's say, if one looks at the historic longue durée of imperial colonial expansionist techniques. The laying of internet, in this case, telecommunications cables across the sea, which is something that even goes back to the time of the kind of British Empire laying its telegraph cables across the earth. Laying telecommunications cables as such to facilitate a foreign power's reach over a disputed area is a long-established colonial practice. In this case, after invading Ukrainian Crimea, Russia extended a cable across the Kerch Strait to bypass Ukrainian telecommunications networks, rerouting data directly to the Russian mainland instead. So what you can see here, we could have done this for each of the individual sections to kind of situate this work in the context of the wider kind of imperial colonial historic practices. But in this case, really, I'd like to kind of refer to the use of telecommunications infrastructure laying in the context of the British Empire, which in this case you can see kind of a depiction across different scales, or the so-called Cape to Cairo telegraph line and associated kind of networks have essentially connected London, the metropole of the empire, to its periphery as an imperial colonial expansionist spatial practice. Essentially establishing GMT, Greenwich Mean Time, across the earth, which, if one looks at one of the earliest events in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Russia has literally changed the time zone of Crimea and has changed the time zone of Crimea to Moscow time, really referring back to a long-established array of kind of imperial colonial practices throughout history. The next scene that you can see here depicts the inauguration, the ceremonial inauguration of a telecommunications tower. In fact, a mobile phone tower, also known as base transceiver station. You can see that the media is being invited and really connecting to kind of the inauguration of a mobile phone tower for people to plug into this network, for people to kind of use to be able to access mobile phone networks. One requires a SIM card. Ukrainian networks failed, people were forced to sign up for Russian ICT technology. And this is another moment where I'd like to go into an example of one of the immersive texts of the exhibition that accompanies each of these scenes. Immersion. There were weeks without a signal. None of the old numbers worked. Nothing sent, nothing received. All the regional networks were down. SIM cards were just a useless integrated circuit printed on a small piece of plastic because the transceivers were no longer sending or receiving. Nothing that is done on a phone can be done on a phone. Messages can be written but not sent. Calls can be attempted but won't connect. No signal out there recognizes these devices. There's someone on the street handing out brochures, a company that no one has heard of. Its logo in green, and further down the street there's a crowd. Someone set up a booth between two green freestanding signs. As people queue up, small groups of people are huddled looking at their phones. Someone stretches out their hand offering SIM cards to people queuing. The promise of reconnection with a new number has become tangible. Russian federal law requires all internet and network service providers to install devices that funnel user data through a vast surveillance network. And that kind of program is also known as the Russian FSB's SORM, S-O-R-M. And these devices have been installed in facilities ranging from switching stations, base transceiver stations, and data centers across Russian-occupied territories. So under the guise of so-called lawful interception, the Russian government has used SORM, this program, this interception program, and its associated devices to throttle sensitive websites, to surveil Russian Ukrainian internet users, and to identify and prosecute dissidents and anti-war activists. Its expansion into Ukraine has only strengthened Russia's hold over its occupied areas. Which leaves me to discuss the last kind of immersive section of the exhibition, which refers to child boarding and care facilities. A small crib contains a soft teddy. The textures of bedding and curtain are warming, but the overall presence in the niche is stark and cold, away from family and familiar homes. The teddy is stitched to the mattress and held in by the bars of the crib. It cannot leave. The wallpaper reflects the bars and stripes of a prison. A sheer lace curtain hints at the presence of an exterior window, an external world that cannot quite be seen from and cannot be escaped to. A nearby table contains Russian textbooks to encapsulate the mind along with the body. Large numbers of Ukrainian children, as I presently speak, are being held in Russian child boarding and care facilities across Russia and Russian-occupied Ukrainian territory. Some were intercepted at military checkpoints by chance, others purposely abducted via child boarding and care facilities. The means by which children have entered the system are varied and complex. Ukrainian authorities and nonprofit organizations estimate that over 10,000 children have been affected by a process that has led many in Ukraine and the international community to accuse the Russian government of forced assimilation and cultural genocide. Which again, in the long durée of imperial colonial expansionist practices, is not too unfamiliar when one looks at the so-called residential school system in what is currently known as Canada. Throughout the invasion, Russian authorities advertised the prospect of free vacations to recreational, educational, and health resorts. What are these kinds of facilities? They can be summer camps, they can be sanatoriums for children and their parents across occupied Ukraine, especially in active conflict zones. Despite the pretext of a temporary so-called evacuation, many of the children who went on these trips effectively found themselves unable to return home. Here again, I'd like to take a moment to read one of the immersive texts. The bus arrives, somewhere warm for the summer, away from the gunshots, shelling, and blackouts. Parents aren't there, but that's not unusual for a school trip. The teacher mentioned that they were somewhere warmer, somewhere by the water. Joking around on the bus, singing songs, that's not unusual for a school trip. They leave the bus in a single file. It's just like a school trip, except the teachers say it's not safe to go back home. And that's one of And that one is to forget about home. It's a free holiday, after all, in a truly fantastic facility. There are classrooms, dining rooms, playgrounds, football fields, games rooms, pool tables, and spas. There is a beach where children can swim, in the sea, under the sun, in the freshest air available. This is a place where they're taken to forget about home, to take their mind off the war that has taken them right here, to this sanatorium, to forget about home. They wonder, will they go home? So really, under the guise of kind of continuing their education, institutions like this sanatorium began instructing Ukrainian children according to Russian curriculums and in the Russian language. In some cases, children were even pressured to accept Russian passports as a condition for finishing their classes. Through a process termed so-called military patriotic education, the Russian education system has become increasingly militarized. So really, it's children that have been obliged to participate in military patriotic marches, in military patriotic activities. You can see here again kind of decoded the performance that essentially these children have been forced to partake in, activities supporting an army invading their homeland. And last but not least, you can see here an orphanage inspection scene where essentially children have been categorized as orphans by Russian authorities regardless of their actual status prior to deportation. What you can see here in this particular scene is in fact a Russian presidential commissioner, in this case Maria, also nicknamed as Masha Lyova-Belova, who inspected, in this case, Ukrainian infants deported from Kherson to promote their adoption into Russian families to be raised as Russians. As such, if we look at the overall intent and the kind of different scenes that are depicted in the exhibition, we can see really the kind of use of model making, of replica making as an effort to really aid people see and to decode kind of power in the built environment. You see, there's an effort below every scene drawing, below every scene model to kind of aid to recognize the facts, to look at what can be decoded in an encoded built environment. And as such, in a way, we're also referring to perhaps moments like in this film, which is called They Live, where someone is finding a pair of sunglasses to really see afterwards the built environment differently. In fact, in this moment in the film, the main protagonist kind of puts on the sunglasses and looking at ads in the built environment, suddenly ads actually speak about consumer culture, and what seems like a banal everyday ad essentially is being transcribed into consume or reproduce and similar kind of terms. So really helping see, helping decode the built environment. And in fact, this is something that I often talk about to my students in my kind of research-based teaching, where an image such as this one, where you have St. Paul's Cathedral in the context of London, the capital of the UK, an image, the very same image, which has been used in two different ways. So the first article, the first kind of newspaper, this is around the same time during the Second World War, after the kind of blitz bombing of St. Paul's Cathedral. It's really St. Paul's Cathedral engulfed by smoke, but the headlines in the UK, in the British Empire at the time, read differently than the headlines of the very same image in Nazi Germany at the time, whereas the Nazi German one is actually saying "Die City von London brennt," which means the city of London is burning. The British one actually says, "War's greatest picture, St. Paul stands unharmed in the midst of the burning city." So you can use that actually the very same image is read in two different ways, which really refers to the idea that both texts and images are organized by social processes. There is no neutral reading and seeing. We are positioned by texts and images, and in fact, texts and images of also built objects. They have preferred ways of reading and seeing, and this is the kind of hegemonic gaze that we're referring to in the exhibition and the larger work of the lab that we're also really seeking to untangle, expose, and ultimately counter. This is an effort, of course, of the lab that is not, that is a group effort, and in fact, it is important to also acknowledge the funding, the individuals, the collaborators, the partners who've been working with us over the years, supporting us in this project. As I mentioned, the lab is a practice, a think tank that's dedicated to exposing intangible systems and hidden agendas within the built environment. But the exhibition has been funded in part by the University of Toronto's Daniels Emerging Architect Fellowship Research Fund, U of T Daniels Office of the Dean Exhibition Installation Grant, the U of T Daniels Office of the Associate Dean of Research Discretionary Fund Grant, U of T's Arts and Science School of Cities Research Award Grant, and various anonymous gifts and donations. Here I'd also like to thank our team at the lab, Bethany for project coordination, our team in research, production, and installation, which included Darian, Farwa, Michelle, Tiffany, Young Mi, Jared, William, Emma, Leanne, Bryson, Alexander, and our team. Composite image making, special thank you to Brandon and Jeffrey. And last but not least, our special advisors, Yuri, Molly, and Mike. With that, I thank you very much for this evening, as we're looking forward to a Q&A conversation together with you, and I'd like to welcome onto the stage Emma and Lily. Thank you. For those of you who would like to pose questions, we have a QR code that you can take a photo of and use to access the questions form. We did this in order for it to be accessible for also our online web audience.
Okay, good evening, everyone. I'd like to be the first to say thank you so much for a fascinating lecture. And Emma and I are now going to jump into some questions concerning what you've just spoken about. So my first tonight is that, as you've mentioned, you are interested in the gray zones between high-level diplomacy and facts on the ground. These two elements have gotten a lot of coverage through the conflict. Can you tell us more about what studying seemingly banal aspects of the built environment reveal about that other fields, such as strict readings of political science or case law, might not be able to easily recognize?
Thank you so much. That's a great question, Lily, that really refers to kind of how practice and scholarship is presently being organized. So in international relations, you have really kind of two distinct domains at large. On the one hand, you kind of have highbrow diplomacy. On the other hand, you kind of have a military sphere of responding to military weapons on the ground. So whereas on the one hand, you really have kind of the idea of kind of diplomatic moments, which is very different from, let's say, a military kind of context. In fact, international relations scholars and practitioners would refer to this as the gray zone. Everything that happens kind of between diplomacy and military warfare is in a gray zone. And this is the very particular gray zone, in fact, that we talk about in the exhibition, which can come in the form of kind of built objects. So in kind of international relations speak, often people would refer to cyber warfare, for example. And we often often kind of coming across this term in the lab, we connect this to, as you've seen in the exhibition, kind of to ICT infrastructure. Cyber is not a kind of invisible something, but it's very tangible on the ground, and the kind of gray zone is also made up of kind of built objects, of architecture, of infrastructure. And it's very important to kind of look at this sort of gray zone between diplomacy, which there is a forum for and which there are existing ways of responding to, and on the other hand, warfare, which there are also existing ways of responding to, but that kind of gray zone is really something that we also should bring into a kind of architecture, geography, media discourse, and not just politics.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Lukas. You've spoken tonight about the importance of imaginary representations, of legal fictions and maps in particular, in constructing sovereignty. Can you speak more to the methods of reading and interpreting that you've leveraged to deconstruct these fictions?
Thank you so much. This really, in a way, the students, and I've seen, thank you so much for many of you coming out tonight. I see some of my students in the space. The kind of methods that we use, the methods of the lab that we use, I often go through my kind of research-based teaching classes, which kind of often combine, let's say, more conventional, if there's such a thing, architectural design research techniques with more unconventional ones, which are more from a kind of field outside. So that would include things like, of course, as a student, one is used to kind of web and library search, but the idea of open source intelligence, for example, or kind of media literacy, essentially, the idea of working with images, image-based analysis, which is visual discourse analysis, or text-based discourse analysis, which is kind of can work hand in hand and along with that. And of course, we're trying to kind of move away from just looking at text and images, but really to kind of look at built objects of architecture. So what would it mean to go beyond kind of textual visual literacy, textual visual reading and writing, but to look at built environment literacy, to really kind of decode buildings, so to speak. Yep.
Thank you very much. I have the next question for you. So as a European affairs student myself, I'm particularly interested in language and its use in politics. Can you elaborate on its use by Russian powers in relation to Ukraine and surrounding regions, either in official statements, in what is and what is not recognized, and in the literal shift that has happened from the official use of Ukrainian to Russian language in occupied territories?
Thank you. That gives me, in fact, the opportunity to talk about something that came up in the lecture, but I'd like to take a moment to actually re-emphasize the kind of role of language is absolutely key in these kinds of sovereignty disputes, in the context not only the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but also other conflicts around the world. Really, in the context of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I've been speaking about here just earlier child boarding and care facilities, and often in that context, the Russian government-sponsored media would refer to essentially forcibly abducted children as evacuees. They're being supposedly evacuated. So that's the kind of doublespeak that I referred to earlier in the lecture, which is really the kind of use of ambiguous language to get a different kind of meaning across. So a lot of our work in kind of open source intelligence, in fact, entailed to kind of critically read Russian media outlets and to really kind of go into the language of what is actually being meant by the terminology that is being used, so to say.
Great. So you've talked a lot about open source data analysis, and I'm really curious about this method. So you use it to look at these imperial colonial relations, its related mechanisms, objects, actors, and representations. Can you elaborate more about what this research process really looks like and what value it might bring to disciplines in the built environment?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think open source intelligence is not very common to look at kind of in the context of architectural design research, but what the kind of value that it brings is essentially what it means is to kind of move away from, let's say, a highbrow kind of scholarly literature, articles, or kind of physical library archives and collections, but more for the lack of a better term, lowbrow sources, blogs, social media, or even just newspaper articles, kind of media research essentially. And what we do with kind of open source intelligence is that we look at different sources, not just well, in addition to scholarly literature, because as these events are presently unfolding, many of these have never been discussed before in scholarly kind of literature. So we use kind of media research through the open source intelligence, but always to make sure that we triangulate things that come up in these media outlets to cross-verify not just once or twice, but multiple times, which is in open source intelligence known as kind of triangulation.
Thank you very much. I have my final question for you. You've already mentioned some connections between conflict in Ukraine and other conflicts that have happened before. Can you elaborate on how the intentional methods that have been used in this conflict can be applied to other imperial colonial pursuits and relationships throughout the project and now? Have there been any key connections or extrapolations that you've been able to make?
Thank you. I suppose this goes back to really the longer kind of ambition of the lab, which is that what's being presented in the exhibition on display at the moment is a case study, is an example in which the kind of larger framework of the lab has been tested, which when one looks at the exhibition at the kind of 4 different niches, they refer to a building type, for example, bank branches or internet and telephone facilities, but each of these building types, in fact, refer to a kind of larger practice. So there are 4 main kind of different practices that we've studied over throughout history, looking at predominantly kind of Euro-Western imperial colonial powers who've used essentially architecture, buildings to project power. I mentioned briefly in the lecture earlier, one of them being sort of the British Empire using telegraph poles in the so-called Scramble of Africa to put down telegraph poles which would give, at the time, which would give rise to a new kind of sovereignty. If I may briefly go into that context, in fact, you had at the time empires such as the Portuguese Empire, which kind of put standards into the ground, kind of larger poles, which would kind of stake a claim similar to what's nowadays a kind of flag to put, like the US American context of putting a flag on the moon. But really the British Empire put down telegraph lines in order to synchronize a periphery with the metropole of London, with its center. And it was giving rise to a new kind of sovereignty, new kind of imaginary of sovereignty, to not only kind of symbolically put down markers, such as the Portuguese Empire at the time, but infrastructure in real time to connect through ICT infrastructure a periphery with its center, to synchronize time, to synchronize decision-making, and that really gave rise to a kind of new technique, which we've seen lately also applied in the context of the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Wonderful. I think it'll be time to turn it over to our audience questions now. So we'll see which kind of questions we have here. Doesn't look like we have any so far, which leads me to ask one of my other questions that I've been very keen on. Oh, do we have any more? Oh, we do have some.
I think you can read the first one.
Thank you.
Okay, so one of our audience members is curious to know why you named this lecture Facts on the Ground, and what are the origins and relation of this phase?
Brilliant question, thanks so much. Recognizing facts on the ground really has to do with kind of the notion of literacy again, the ability to kind of read and write. A lot of the efforts in the exhibition, in fact, the exhibition, I would even say, is a kind of teaching aid, in fact. The idea is to give people the ability to recognize how power is being written into the built environment, how a bank branch is not just a bank branch in this instance, but it's in fact an instrument of power projection. And that kind of ability to recognize these instruments in the built environment is really referring to kind of giving new ways of seeing, and as such is a teaching aid. I suppose this is also where kind of the work of the lab in practice, research and teaching really intersects.
Okay, I have your next question. it says that you've mentioned open source intelligence. What kind of tools or sources were used to collect this information, and was it all sourced from the internet?
What was the last part? Was it all sourced from?
From the web.
Thank you. One has to really kind of adopt, for each project is culturally and geographically specific. So for example, part of open source intelligence research is consulting, for example, social media. But of course, social media in a Russian context or Russian-speaking context can mean essentially different social media platforms. The platforms that are existent in social media in a Euro-Western context have their local equivalents in a Russian context. That does not necessarily just entail the web or social media. There are also other kind of radio, TV broadcasting outlets. So really open source intelligence can mean in a greater part the web, but it is not limited to the web. So there's also other type of media, but essentially it refers to kind of going beyond the, for the lack of a better term, kind of highbrow scholarly literature. Yeah, which often, in fact, is for the simple fact of being in real time, and as such, crowdsourced, etc. There's many reasons why one may go beyond. Yep.
Absolutely, and you've also mentioned in the past going into Russian sources beyond just what is accessible to people on English web.
Yeah, in fact, if I may add to that, what's really interesting is, in fact, that many, if not predominantly our sources, in fact, are Russian sources. Of course, we look at them very critically, really critically looking at the kind of language that's being used, the doublespeak that may be used. You know, if it says evacuees, one would look at what is actually meant by that term, but it's not that, in fact, we're looking kind of behind the scenes at something that is not available to the public. All of this is, as the name says, open source. It's freely available, but we critically look at these kind of things, triangulate what appears in one source has to appear in other places too, in order to be taken for granted and verified and making it into the research project. So I think it may really often surprise people that in fact most of our sources are Russian media outlets that we critically decode as such.
Great, thank you, Lukas. One of our audience members wants to know, will you be publishing this research somewhere?
Let's not get ahead of ourselves. We are in the process of a publication. This is a larger kind of framework. In fact, what's interesting is that the short answer, yes, absolutely. We were only able to show 4 case types of buildings, of architecture in the exhibition. In the process of this work, which let's say in the research phase has been going on in the exhibition for a couple of years now, in the production phase several months, but really there's a kind of archive of different case types, of different kind of building types that we're looking to publish in larger and wider and different contexts, definitely.
All right, I have another question.
Thank you.
And audience members, if you have any burning questions, please do feel free to submit them. I have a question about violence and how you define that and what it looks like. So you've provided various examples about how former Ukrainian facilities have been converted into Russian ones. Now, when we think about violence, conventionally, we think about perhaps military ventures or things of that kind of sort. So can you elaborate on how actions such as very banal conversions constitute violence and how this kind of everyday violence really impacts victims on the ground?
That's a really good question that is worth thinking about, because I think what really, there's a whole spectrum of violence, and violence can absolutely come in different forms. Physical violence is only a part of that spectrum, so really kind of things like hate crimes, the use of language, the use of, and again, this is really throughout the work, kind of not just textual language, not just words, but also images can be violent, and buildings as such can be violent, but I think it requires a different kind of understanding, a different kind of mindset, where it's often a kind of more symbolic violence or a functional violence in the way that kind of an infrastructure is working in order to enable certain imaginaries to become a base for other types of violence to happen later. So I think as such, it is really important to kind of extend the spectrum of violence also in the realm of policy making. That it is, as I mentioned earlier, it's not just diplomacy on the one hand or military weapons on the other hand, but there's this kind of gray area of really visual, material, and spatial forms that we need to better understand in order to really respond to them.
I have another question for you. Do you think that with your research into these banal forms of just banal features, we can come to better understand and perhaps catch future forms of power that seem peaceful but are in fact inherently predatory?
Absolutely. I mean, that's the whole point of kind of recognizing those facts on the ground. And I think one of the things that the lab is also working on kind of long term is we've taught a series of courses that refer to counter-hegemonic practices. So what I kind of presented as part of today is really hegemonic visual, material, and spatial practices, both historically but also ongoing. And the notion of kind of counter-hegemonic practice is really important to think because, of course, we're not just interested in kind of exposing how to steal, but we're also interested in exposing to reconstitute, to regain, to reclaim, to counter those violence and violent moments. And I think without going too much into detail for now, but I think we can, an immediate example in the kind of context of what's presently known as Australia, the Indigenous Tent Embassy in the so-called Australian capital city, essentially refers to the Indigenous Tent Embassy is a building, a kind of tent-like looking structure that was mimicking the language of Euro-Western powers. The idea of an embassy is a European Western architectural invention, and the Indigenous Tent Embassy was kind of using the language of Euro-Western powers against Euro-Western powers. So the Indigenous Tent Embassy was a project by a series of indigenous local activists who, and as part of a land-back movement, who built this structure in order to counter the forces of the Australian nation state. And there are countless of examples of case studies of practices that are visual, material, and spatial that are essentially, should be a part of architectural discourse in order to counter.
Thank you.
So I have another question about the exhibition itself and about the exhibition design, which you've spoken quite extensively on in the immersion aspect. But a lot of what the Canadian public has been exposed to regarding the Russia and Ukraine conflict has mainly come through, mass journalism and news media. So I'm really interested in how the format of an exhibition differs as a form of public education and what unique learning opportunities you see this medium providing, especially in an institution like this.
Thank you, Emma. I mean, it is not by chance that this exhibition also is in an educational environment. Really, the format, the medium, the format of the exhibition on display is a kind of exhibition as a teaching aid. The longer term idea and vision is to, and this is also kind of coming into potential questions such as what can we do here, what can we do now? The idea is that to do things like walking tours for newcomers, for Ukrainian newcomers to help who fled the conflict, and to inspire a new generation of young students, but also scholars to make change in the way that policy making needs to recognize that there is not just the dimension of diplomacy on the one hand, or the dimension of kind of power projection through military spheres on the other hand, but that in fact buildings, that architecture has an agency in this. Architects are being instrumentalized as we speak to project power in these contexts. And I think it's so incredibly important for architects in this building, but also for the other disciplines invited, and the project speaks to many disciplines, to really gain awareness that the kind of education one gets is not just a neutral one. The kind of buildings one designs may be inevitably or not at some point actively or indirectly instrumentalized for power projection. So it's really about raising awareness, but with the long-term intent to kind of to counter, to undo counter-hegemonic practice. Hegemonic practice, yeah. Thanks so much.
I don't think we have any more questions. Do you have any last remarks or things you'd like to say?
Well, I think it's lovely. It's nice to chat to the two of you, given that you're presently students and that you represent kind of different disciplines. I'm also very excited about having been a faculty advisor for, in the case of Emma, a journal as a shout out called Scaffold Journal, which will launch very soon. The first issue will come up soon, and it's an intent, a student-led effort really to talk more about research methods, visual research methods, and it's also the work of the lab, given the interest in kind of research methods and unconventional research methods. I think there's a bright time ahead for architecture students to really discuss how power can be exposed in the built environment through unconventional means of research. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Lukas.